quantum objects are objects of possibility for consciousness to choose from. So consciousness is the ground of being in which matter and non-matter, both kinds of objects, exist as possibilities for consciousness to choose from. Consciousness is the ground of being. In quantum way of looking at it, consciousness is everything. And the reason we perceive ourselves separate from everything else is because we identify with the brain. But brain is a possibility of consciousness to choose from, instead of the other way around. Brain does not create consciousness. Consciousness manifests the brain. Brain is a possibility in consciousness that consciousness manifests in the process of experiencing the world. And then 5 years later, it was replicated and then replicated again and replicated again. Now there are 2 dozen experiments which has replicated that same idea. So there is no doubt that people can communicate directly without using signals. So there is no doubt that people can expand their consciousness to include another.
G'day folks, I'm Rowan. This is Michael, my brother. Today we interviewed a very special guest, a quantum physicist, Amit Goswami. He's been on the Joe Rogan podcast, he's been everywhere, he's got his own university and school. He's been in the field of quantum physics for at least 30 to 40 years, and he wrote some textbooks which are still actually standard in many universities today. But many decades ago, he suddenly had this experience which prompted him to leave the traditional field and start his own thing. Today we're going to be talking about non-local consciousness, addiction, archetypes and how they relate to meaning. It was a very good podcast, very relatable and very important for what's happening in the times ahead. How did you like it, mate?
I love that podcast. I'm super energized. I definitely think that guy's a true master and kind-hearted, very joyful, chummy energy, I'd say. I was particularly impressed and learned a lot from his views on addiction. And if you're curious about addiction, you're struggling with it, or you know anyone else is struggling with addiction, I recommend checking it out. And yeah, enjoy.
So, Amit, thank you for joining us. What is consciousness exactly, and how do you see it being generated? Do you think it's something fundamental? Do you think it's something generated in the brain? What's your opinion?
Yeah, this is a very good question to begin with, because in the materialist worldview that scientists have today, it is extremely difficult to define consciousness in a proper way. The way we experience it, it is very important to note, is that we are looking at the world separate from us. We experience ourselves as an I, experiencing the world which is separate from us. We are subjects and the objects of the world are objects. This is the way we experience it. But how to explain it when you have a science of objects only is a riddle, because materialist science only have objects. Newtonian physics only define objects. So what to do? Quantum physics is such a way out. Quantum physics says that quantum objects are objects of possibility for consciousness to choose from. So consciousness is the ground of being in which matter and non-matter, both kinds of objects, exist as possibilities for consciousness to choose from. This is the definition that fits everything, and this is the definition on which a new science, new paradigm of science can be built. How does the brain fit in? Well, the brain fit in is a very important question, because again, brain is an object. So how does consciousness identify with the brain? So one has to see that if the brain has a tangled hierarchy, a hierarchy that creates a circular trap for consciousness to identify with, then consciousness gets trapped in this tangled hierarchy of the brain, and the perception is, an appearance is, that consciousness is now separate from the rest of the world, as identified with the brain. So tangled hierarchy of the brain creates a trap for consciousness to identify with. Once it identifies with, it looks at the world as separate from itself. That's the solution of the whole mystery.
What is the exact mechanism in which lies behind the brain thinking it generates consciousness rather than how does it get tricked like that exactly?
Well, in the materialist theory, since we have only objects, so there is only one way of thinking, but this is not a philosophically very tangible way of thinking, which is that somehow when the objects become very complex, out of that complexity, new steps tend to emerge. Emergent ideas. So consciousness is an emergent idea from matter. That's the way that they think of it, out of material complexity.
Mm.
But nobody has been able to demonstrate that complexity gives rise to something which is not object, because you are still dealing with objects being complex. Objects can only produce objects. Objects can never produce this separateness from objects.
Mm. It's very interesting because as I was preparing for this podcast, I look back at an old podcast you did maybe 10 years ago, maybe more with Joe Rogan. And as I was listening to the podcast, I was like, wow, this is fascinating because this whole time the conversation is flowing really well and Joe's really receptive to it. And it's such a cool engagement. But as you're explaining this experiment, but I think it was done in 1994, where two people were put in a Faraday cage so no signals could get out. But they were still, the brain waves were showing that they were very, very similar. And you're showing how this proves that there's a network which operates non-locally because no signals can interact. And you're saying how this is sort of the idea behind how consciousness is non-local. And it was very, very interesting because he couldn't really wrap his head around that topic. And I find that in general life, even bringing up the subject of consciousness being non-local is like so taboo, you just don't do it. You know, some people perceive things some way, you perceive things another, that's fine. But sort of using that as a case study, that conversation you had with him, what do you think is the reason why some people can understand or some people are interested in finding out about consciousness and what it is, and why some people fall into a different mindset?
Well, the materialist mindset makes a lot of sense to many people because they never experience consciousness in the non-local way. See, non-locality is feeling a oneness between you and me. We are directly communicating without using signals. So in a sense, you and I have become one. That requires my consciousness, instead of identifying with my brain alone, also include you in the way that I reckon myself to be, which I call expansion of consciousness. This to experience expansion of consciousness, people need to meditate, people need to slow down, people need to pay more attention to awareness. All these things people don't want to do. And whoever don't do it, for them, it is a mystery because they always experience their consciousness as part of the brain. They cannot get used to the idea that brain can expand and involve another. Like loving somebody means that I'm including that person within my consciousness. But they don't think of love that way. They think of love as having sex. So you see how one avoids these questions of expansion. But anyone who has the experience of expanding consciousness, like anyone who has meditated seriously, or even in sex, anyone who cuddles after the sexual act is over, then they feel the expansion, that the heart is expanded to include the other. That is what is called love. So anyone who understands love, anyone who understands meditation, anyone who pays attention to the feelings that are in our body, easily accepts the idea that consciousness is the ground of being. Others who are not experiencing these things, they still think that the consciousness is a brain phenomenon because it's always associated with just my brain, not anything else.
Yeah.
So looking at somebody, looking at the experiment that you referred to, Jacobo Greenberg's transfer potential experiment, is a very liberating experience. But again, you have to look at the experiment without prejudice. If you have the prejudice of materialism, then you say, well, the experiment must be wrong. I remember I came back from, I participated in the experiment in 1992
Oh,
fall.
wow.
And I came back to my physics department, and one of my colleagues, who was a friend of mine, he said, if you publish this paper, you're going to be disgraced from the scientific community. He could not accept the fact that this is a legitimate experiment with legitimate results. And then 5 years later, it was replicated, and then replicated again and replicated again. Now there are 24, 2 dozen experiments which has replicated
Wow.
that same idea. So there is no doubt that people can communicate directly without using signals. So there is no doubt that people can expand their consciousness to include another.
Wow, that's so interesting because I was going through AI yesterday and I was asking you about that experiment and I was saying, what's your view on this? Do you think consciousness is non-local or do you think it's generated by the brain? And we had a little back and forth and
So,
basically
as
they
I
were like,
said,
yeah, yeah.
consciousness is the ground of being. In quantum way of looking at it, consciousness is everything. And the reason we perceive ourselves separate from everything else is because we identify with the brain. But brain is a possibility of consciousness to choose from,
Mm,
instead of the other way around. Brain does not create consciousness. Consciousness manifests the brain. Brain is a possibility in consciousness that consciousness manifests in the process of experiencing the world. This
mm,
is the actual way that we should think.
mm. That leads into a good question. There's another study by Benjamin and Libet in 1979 where they was basically proved they were tracking people's brain states and they said the action someone took came before they were aware that they took the action, or more or less. And so lots of people go, oh, okay, yeah, so that's basically proof of, we don't have free will, blah, blah, blah. But then there's the other side of it, what you're talking about here, which is you can get into a state where you can choose from any possibility there is, a still mind, or some people might call it something else. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that relates to the other side of that study and how it relates to consciousness?
Yeah, the point is that the way consciousness comes down to the brain is a bit complicated. Initially, at the present moment, there is the conscious identity that we call the quantum self, which is non-local. But then there is a lot of reflection in the mirror of memory, because when a stimulus arrives at the brain, not only the stimulus arrives, but the stimulus may have been experienced before, and for which there was a memory in the brain. Then the memory also will play. And there could be many memories of some stimulus that we are very used to. Like I'm used to seeing another person. So when I see another person, there's a lot of memory associated with seeing people. And therefore, all those memories will play. And out of which I'll recognize, oh, I have really seen this person, and this person is this. So all those reflections in the mirror of memory produces a state that we call the ego, which
Mm,
is the result of our personal history. And this is the problem. So when we identify with the ego, then of course the quantum self-experience that already has happened before then. So for which there is a brain signature. So it seems like the brain already has seen the stimulus, but that's the memory of the quantum self. That is how the brain is making a registration of the thinking before we actually become aware of the thinking, because we are aware of the thinking only in our ego. And the ego and the quantum self is separated by half a second of time.
mm,
Half a second before, there were already quantum self-experience for which the brain has a record, which is what they observe in something like readiness potential, which is the EEG reading even before you think. Okay, so
mm.
that's an explanation for all this.
That's so interesting. So I guess the next question to that would be, how do you get into that quantum self then, the one that comes before the egoic identification?
This is why meditation is so important. So what we have to realize is that the brain acts in a very fast mode for people, and they are not able to capture this quantum self-experience. If we slow down by using the process of meditation, then this reaction time from 500 milliseconds, it reduces. reduces to 300, even 200 milliseconds. When it reduces like that, we are able to experience or fall into quantum self more often and feel the expansion. So this is why people are constantly asked to meditate in the spiritual traditions.
It's interesting. You have a question? So one of the things that's really like taking society over storm at the moment is AI, of course. And people worrying about losing their jobs to AI is one of those things. But when you talk about fundamentally archetypes and how they give creation to meaning, you sort of give a hint to the fact that jobs used to be a way where we could channel an archetype or go into an archetype. And we've sort of lost our connection with that. Now a job's more about, going to work to earn a living rather than actually going to one of those archetypes, whatever they may be. So do you feel like that is going to be just as important or maybe even more important in the future, that people learn to connect to archetypes? Maybe you could even talk a little bit about what an archetype is and how that relates to meaning and what you think that will relate to with AI.
We are at the height of information processing way of using ourselves in the conceptualization and actualization of artificial intelligence. So the more we use something like generative artificial intelligence to substitute for the human being. For example, many people are using AI to act as their counselor because the AI is a very good listener. It does not interfere with what you're talking. So you can talk, and the AI will very nice to listen and give appropriate answers once in a while. That is very comforting to some people. But that comfort is a false comfort. It's a comfort because you don't usually get to speak and you're not allowed to speak. It's a permissive situation that they like. But the danger of the situation is that the responses are all trivial responses. They are programmed responses based on statistical evaluation of what should the response be at this present moment. It's completely statistically figured out. So it really does not give you any insight, whereas archetypes are the opposite. If you are creative, only human beings can do that. Computers cannot do that. Computers are solely based on information. Archetype is when you go beyond information and try to find meaning. Archetypes take us to higher meaning, new meaning. So that archetypal experience is what we are losing out. And I'm very concerned about this because if our young people become so used to socialize only with computers, then when will they learn about the meaningful things about in their life, which are the archetypes? The purpose of life is to explore and embody archetypes like love, beauty, justice, truth, goodness in our being. If we lose that capacity of embodying these archetypes, just imagine how dry, how inconsequential a human being will be. They will be incapable of any relationship. So the whole concept of human relationships will disappear. The society will just be a concept on the internet that people connect to it in terms of images of each other, seeing on social media with superficial news. Look at my picture, look at my picture. That's what we do on the internet. We don't do any meaningful communication. This is what will happen to people in the future if we continue this way of allowing children to interact with generative AI. So it's a very serious thing, and some people are in fact pushing it for education, which is not entirely wrong, of course, because AI can be used in a very constructive way. But allowing only AI in people's lives and not educating them with the archetypes, this is not going to work. This is absolutely going to lead to disaster because it will ruin human relationship and human society. The connectivity that we need will be lacking.
Would you mind giving like a brief rundown of maybe a few archetypes so people can know what exactly they are, how they can be used in life, and maybe an example of an archetype not being used and how that would manifest in a particular field or a particular job, for example?
I think the easiest archetype for people is to not to consider an archetype connected with jobs. We can do that too, such as with the archetype of truth, which is what scientists investigate. But I think it's easiest for people to relate to the archetype of love, because everyone has experience of relationship and maybe even a glimpse of love once in a while. Like I said, if after sex you cuddle, then you get an expansion of consciousness and caring for the other, which is sort of love showing up in your experience. So experience of love go that way. So if you just experience it, for example, in sexual experiences, that's the beginning. And then you learn to experience, see the fact that, when you like something, when you see beauty, for example, we see a beautiful sunset. The tendency will be, if you are with your companion, come, honey, look at this beautiful sunset. You share it. Share it. Why? Because we are sharing our consciousness with another person. We are expanding our consciousness. Our consciousness is already expanded by seeing the archetype of beauty. And we want to share, because that's what it means. Expansion means the ability of sharing. We share an experience with a person. So this is the kind of thing that makes people aware. Okay, 1 minute ago, I was not able to share my consciousness. I was into myself. I was just thinking away of all these anxiety-producing thoughts, anxiety-producing, what is happening in Venezuela. And all of a sudden, I see the sunset, and I don't care about Venezuela anymore. I care about sharing with you the experience of the sunset. This is the point. That expansion of consciousness, if people learn to associate with archetypal experiences, then that will go a long way towards engaging with archetype, because expansion of consciousness is a very happy experience. Happiness and wholeness, they have the same etymological origin. So wholeness is what we get when we look at an archetype. Like you look at the archetype of beauty, your consciousness expands and you're closer to the whole. You're not very expanded. Whole is the entire world. You're not that expanded, but you're still partially expanded. You're out of your own cocoon of the ego. This is the important thing. And that experience, when people have that, they will find that it comes with happiness. There's an innate happiness in that state. And then that's what attaches us to love. We want a companion that we can love, because the existence of the companion takes us to that expanded happy state. Of course, there is also a brain association with that. Brain also tends to emit dopamine molecules when such things happen. So that's a good thing, because these dopamine molecules also produce a state of euphoria. That's how narcotics work. They produce dopamine molecules in our brain. So in a way, these archetypes can also help taking the brain in a state where there will be molecules of happiness.
So that's kind of really relevant to what we're doing, because one of the things we do is run a rehab for people who have addictions. So in terms of addictions and people battling with that, no matter what it is, I guess it doesn't matter. What would your advice be to someone suffering from addiction, or how do addictions relate to this consciousness? Because I guess non-consciousness leads to wholeness, as you're saying. Do you think that is sort of an antidote or a way to help people? What do you think?
It can be an antidote. However, one has to remember that most addicted people become addicted because they're trying to avoid a part of themselves which are subjected to trauma. So this trauma clearance is a very good part of addiction prevention. If a person become traumatic in the experience of certain things in their life, they try to avoid that distress of trauma by drowning themselves into a substance addiction. So if one understands this, then the first job for addicted people is to clear them of that traumatic experience. There are many ways that we can do trauma clearance, including cognitive behavioral way, eye movement, desensitization, regimen that people have developed. There are also quantum ways of taking quantum leaps out of the trauma. So there are many ways of, so there are energy processes, energy psychology that can be used. Energy meaning vital energy. We can use tapping like this. Tap, 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 tap. And in that way, we touch sensitive points in the body. These are on the meridians, Chinese style. So these acupressure points that they're called, these acupressure points, if you tap on them, that seems to clear up the trauma because the trauma is concentrated on these points of acupressure points in the body. That does not do entirely a job because there is also a part that the brain plays, but the accumulation of vital energy blocks in specific points of the body, that can be cleared up by simply tapping the body. This was discovered by a scientist named Roger Callahan. Very beautiful discovery. So that can be used to clear up the trauma. After the trauma is cleared, then is the time to introduce the idea of archetypes and happiness. And then you get the person to explore an archetype and become expanded. So the need for the addiction, because addiction is when there are brain circuits which produce this craving. And the craving is what gets into the problem, because craving means there will be a certain amount of compulsion. Otherwise, there will be body symptoms that arise, withdrawal symptoms. To avoid these withdrawal symptoms, we got to control the craving circuits. But in order to control the craving circuits, we have to go through some deconditioning. So this is why people have to spend time in a rehabilitation center where they're deconditioned against these craving circuits, against this substance dependence withdrawal symptoms. Only after you have done all that, what happens after you have spent time with the rehabilitation center, let's say 5 weeks you have spent in a rehabilitation center and you don't feel that compulsion anymore. But what happens usually is that people come back into their regular life, but still eventually they again fall back. That part can be prevented now by a meditative regime with happiness producing archetypal exploration. So there are 3 stages here: trauma clearance, a clearance up of the dependence part of that the brain has suffered, these craving circuits and the withdrawal symptoms. So a rehabilitation is necessary. And after the rehabilitation, you do the archetypal exploration and embodiment. These 3 processes together, I think this still has to be verified. We haven't had any study that these processes together will work, but I think it will work, especially if the last part produces a quantum leap. This is a crucial thing. A quantum leap, a discontinuous change in the brain. And this discontinuous change has to take place before that craving does not reappear.
And you mentioned the archetypal change of happiness is very important. Does it have to be happiness that they have to embody that archetype, or can there be many different ones? It's individual for each person. What would it look like if they were trying to embody the archetype of happiness? What does that mean exactly?
Any of the archetypes will do. Even archetypes of power, if we explore it with the conjunction with the archetype of goodness or love, that works. Archetype of power, archetype of abundance, even they work. Best thing is to work with archetype of love and goodness. But if you work on archetype of truth or beauty or justice, they also work. I already mentioned love in conjunction with beauty. So beauty is a very important archetype in this connection as well. We have to learn to see beauty and we have to explore nature for that. And these are very good habits for people who are addicts. To go into nature walks and stuff like that and feel the expansion. But as I said, those steps are very important. But eventually, even after rehabilitation, what happens is that the craving circuits go into dormancy. They don't entirely go away. And this is why the person can be triggered into fall back into addiction very quickly. If you see somebody drinking, immediately they would also want to have a drink because the craving circuits are there. They're just into a short recess. So in order for the craving circuits to really go away, stop this addiction to the craving circuits, we really have to get to the archetypes, explore the archetypes, because then we can take a quantum leap of embodiment of the archetypes when there would be a positive emotional brain circuit that will balance the negativity that takes us towards craving.
So the archetype, in a sense, is a framework that you can tap into, which has its own energy. And when you sort of,
Which is good in us, which is high energy, which is the high vital energy that we need.
yeah, and you can flow with that energy, and it's sort of like you're hopping into that, and it can take you rather than trying to make your own way through some egoistic or ego ideal of what you could be doing.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
interesting. You've talked about how even though science is quite materialistic at the moment, and of course materialistic science isn't bad, but it does have its limitations, which I think is beginning to be acknowledged. You've also mentioned that on the grand scheme of things, it seems to be like that the science is going more into the non-dual realm or less materialistic. Why do you feel like that's the case? And maybe along with that, what do you feel like the future of science will be in the next 10 years, 20 years, etc.?
Well, right now, looking at the world, it is very hard to picture an optimistic future. But I am personally very optimistic. I think we'll go through this crisis as a trigger for a new phase, optimistic phase of ascension of humanity. In fact, I just published a book called The Ascent of Humanity, in which I propose that the next step of human beings is a stage where we'll study the archetypes en masse and embody the archetypes. And the humanity will totally change and we will have a peaceful world eventually. It will take maybe hundreds of years, but it's going to come. In the go of things, you have to remember, human beings have been around for more than 1 million years. And therefore, we should not be scared of 100 years or 200 years or 300 years for something to happen. This thing that is happening is a very new thing. It started only in around 1960s that we started becoming materialistic. And that materialistic bend that was created in the 1960s and finalized in 1980s, that is what has brought this division, this polarization of society into the part which is materialistic and the part which holds on to the old-fashioned religious worldview. This is the battle. Although the battles are not straightforward, and therefore nobody will say that, oh, I'm a materialist, nobody will say I'm a religionist, and therefore we are fighting. Nobody will say like that because the whole idea of worldview being polarized between science and religion, that whole idea, people just don't think that way anymore. They just don't think very deeply anymore. They only think of things like what is happening immediately in terms of information. Social media dominates their thinking. So people are not thinking the deeper reason for the polarization of the society between one faction that goes to college and gets more meaning in their life, and another faction which does not get any new meaning at all in their life, and they become more stagnant than the other faction. But both factions are stuck. Both factions are stuck in the old, because materialism also does not take you to the new, the creative stuff. It also avoids the creative stuff. Religion, of course, are very stuck in the very old. So it's a difference between very old and relatively old. But it's not, neither faction is supporting creativity. And it's the creativity that is latent that we need. But the important thing is, as psychologist David Hawking showed, that there is a significant part of the human society. Hawking's calculation is that 15%. Maybe that's a little bit high estimate in my opinion, but maybe even 5%, 10%, if they are into creativity, if they are into meditation, then that's a substantial percentage. In a company, if somebody owns a stock of more than about 6%, they get a voice. So I am certain that we already have crossed the 6% threshold to deserve a hearing in the society, and we are getting a hearing. My friends and I, especially my collaborator Valentin Ornisor and I, we teach a transformative educational program leading to master's, PhD, and certification. And this program is transformational. We actually teach people how to do yoga, how to meditate, how to use qigong, how to use tai chi, how to use pranayama to change their life, not only concepts. But we primatize. The most important thing is to change your worldview, and therefore we teach a lot of new concepts that quantum physics gives us. And we are getting results. So we are operating for 6 years, and we have graduated many students. And they are, unabashedly, I can say, they are partially transformed. They are changed. They are not going to go back to their previous life. They're going to be a little bit meditator, a little bit of relationship capacity, a little bit of archetypal investigation capacity. All these things they're going to have. And they are now used to that. They cannot quit because those things, although we have a reluctance to engage those, once we engage, we become happy. This is the key. So once people can be put in the path of the archetypes, it is a beautiful thing to watch because it only can go forward. It seldom falls back to previous conditioned state of unhappiness. Once you taste happiness, you cannot go back to unhappiness and replace happiness by entertainment or pleasure hunting. The problem is that people find substitute of happiness in pleasure. But as soon as the pleasureful activity is finished, they're back into their empty life and unhappy life. You cannot avoid unhappiness engaging in pleasure. Like the idea that, when LSD was very prominent in society, I have heard people say, well, it's very simple to live a happy life. Just continue to take LSD. As soon as the LSD runs out, you take another dosage of LSD. And that way you'll be always happy. But it's not so. LSD cannot keep you constantly because if you do that, your brain will not be able to cope with it. Very soon it will cause all kinds of problems with you. So this the idea of continuous pleasure hunting is completely false. You cannot have, our body is not built that way. You cannot go on and having sex, one sex after sex after sex. You cannot just do that. Your body is not capable of it. Same thing about eating. We cannot just eat and therefore feel pleasure and avoid unhappiness. We cannot do that. Our body is not built that way. We cannot take drugs continuously and be happy. Our body is not built that way. It deteriorates if we try to do that. So this is the lesson that we have to learn. Only way that we can have permanent happiness in our life is inviting the archetypes in our life and engage with them.
Is that happiness neurochemical still, or is it
This happiness is expansion of consciousness. The pleasure-oriented happiness is chemically, molecules are responsible, like dopamine I already mentioned. But the happiness that we get from expansion of consciousness, dopamine maybe an associated effect, but it's not cause of expansion. Expansion is caused by enlargement of consciousness because you are directly investigating consciousness through the archetypes. You are intuiting. Your intuitive life is open. Your creative life is open. That's what causing the expansion. And that expansion may have other effect on the brain, which is part of the dopamine story. But dopamine is not causing the expansion. You are causing the expansion by engaging with the direct communication with consciousness that intuitions and creativity are about.
Great.
So many questions from there. One of them was very interesting. I was surprised to hear you say it's a very recent phenomenon. Materialism sort of took over in the 60s and then got cemented in the 80s. What was happening at that time where that was the case?
Well, I remember it very well because, in 63, I transferred myself from India to United States, which was the center of all these happenings at that time. 60s was a time when we saw clearly the competition between the coming of materialism, some people doing that, and the coming of idealism. these consciousness ideas, people who are coming from India, coming from Japan, Zen masters, the Sufis who are coming from the Middle East, the Christians who are looking at archetypes in terms of esoteric Christianity, not the popular version of Christianity, which is separateness producing. So there were a lot of changes that are happening on both camps. Unfortunately, the materialists won the battle. The 70s came, and with that, I don't know if you were born yet, but probably very, very little children at that time. So you may not remember, but we have lines of gasoline because of the Middle Eastern problems. Iran had great conflicts, regime change, and all this. So all of a sudden, we have gasoline shortage and gasoline lines. People became more and more concerned about day-to-day living. And that took them away from that possibility of expansion of consciousness. And the materialists won the war between the two. That was very unfortunate. So the 80s is when the transformation took place. The philosophers sealed the situation by claiming that they have proven that the spiritual is false, or there is only matter, and what we experience as spirit is our vain imagination. It's not real. That spiritual archetypes are only fingers pointing to the moon, but there is no moon. And we assume that there is a moon. This was the claim of the proof. But I have directly experienced the oneness with everything. So this claim is not true. This claim is just the inadequacy of the investigators to try to reach that state. That state you cannot reach by simply meditating. You have to take a quantum leap. Electrons, when they jump from one atomic orbit to another, they don't go through the intermediate space. That's called the quantum leap. We have to do the same kind of thing. We have to fall into the quantum self. So I once did a 7-day of meditation, more or less continuously. And that produced a state in which I fall into. I mean, I didn't deliberately create that state. I just all of a sudden found myself as one with everything. That's the way it felt to me. That state lasted only for a few seconds, but it produced an aftermath in which I had the capacity of loving everyone, literally. Even my enemies became somebody who is lovable. I'll never forget that experience. So this is the kind of experience that totally convinces you that consciousness is the ground of being, and there is just no other way of thinking of reality. But if you don't have that experience, then what? That's the problem. I mean, it takes a lot of meditation in order to fall into such states. But it is much easier to fall into a state of expansion that love gives us. So that's the beginning that I support. What I did was kind of, scientific curiosity, combination of scientific curiosity and a little bit of desperation, because my relationships were still not working. So I became a little desperate. Okay, how to discover love? That was the point. And indeed, I discovered love this way. Yes, it is possible to love everyone. But that state went away after a couple of days. So then I had to work for years to get back that capacity of being able to love almost everyone. I wouldn't claim that I can love everyone because I have not interacted with everyone, but people that I interact with, I am able to love. So that is something that tells me that, yeah, consciousness is the ground of all being. But most people do not have that tenacity of investigation to stick to it, to stick to the idea and investigate in a sincere way. So that's a little bit too far away. In our school, we just teach people how to generate positive emotions to balance the negative emotion, because then there will be sort of state of equilibrium in which at least they won't be negative. This is the same kind of positive psychology that Harvard is pushing now. So that's a good thing that is happening all over the world.
Wow. So creativity is a very important thing in life, and I feel like, especially these days, with the advent of things like AI, creativity is maybe becoming less accessible for people because their brainwaves are in a different state all the time, maybe a hyperactive one rather than something that's accessible. Um, what's your research led you to understand on creativity and how we access it?
Well, the biggest prevention of creative exploration is, of course, what you mentioned just now, hyperactivity. Hyperactivity and intellectualism. We think that we can solve every problem with our mind just by thinking. We don't need the archetypes. And in addition, if we develop hyperactivity, then we cannot engage with everything for a very long time because hyperactivity makes you restless, does not allow you to pay attention to something. And without paying attention, without the ability of focusing, we cannot investigate, we cannot explore. We cannot explore something that creativity takes us. Creativity just not cannot enter when we become hyperactive, when we become intellectually oriented. So you have to deal with these defects of the brain that brain picks up because of our upbringing. If our upbringings were all natural and correct, if our parents behaved the right way, if the teachers taught the right way, then of course nobody would be hyperactive, although there is some brain components here. I'm not claiming that brain does not play any role, genes don't play any role. Genes do play some role. So some people are born with some brain defects that leads to autism or things like that. But majority of people really suffer from their avoidance of creativity because of their upbringing. If we have a healthier upbringing, where people were allowed to expand themselves, where people or mothers gave their love freely, where fathers took care of the children in spite of the fact that they don't have a direct non-local connection with the children, but still they try to develop the connection. If teachers likewise try to develop a two-way communication channel that I call tangled hierarchy, this kind of relationship, if people were aware that there are stages that brain develops in, and we can go along with those stages and not violate those stages. For example, now the neuroscience is telling us from 0 to 9, we expand the brain in ways that are very undisciplined. All kinds of connections develop. But then after the age of 9, we become more disciplined. We become more efficient in terms of connectivity of the brain. And then the brain becomes stable at the age 32. That's when we really become adult. So this kind of thing, after we become adult, we can take a chance again. We can investigate the archetypes. So it's now very clear that if we miss the archetypal exploration at young age, like when we are 15 or 16, when we choose our career, if we miss the archetypal exploration in our profession initially, we can later correct it. And later is not much later. It begins at age 32. Change my own archetypal change from no archetype to yes archetype at age 37. So it's right with what the neuroscientists are finding. Midlife transition is exactly what they are saying, that yes, at age 32, brain settles down. That's when we take chances of archetypal exploration, finding the purpose of our life and changing our life. People call it midlife transition, and that's a very good name. That is the midlife, beginning at 32. And then we get a very stable midlife, 32 to 66. The brain does not change very much. And this is the time that we can explore the mind. We can explore the vital. When physical body is stable, physical hardware is stable, we can now concentrate on developing the software. So if we change our educational system, our job system, in such a way as to be compatible with neuroscience and quantum science, we would be doing just fine. And that is the way to overcome this crisis. The crisis is pointing out to us that what we are doing now is not working. We are better off by changing, and as fast as we can change, the more better off we are. So the crisis will deepen. Right now we are going through a huge crisis in American expansionism. We'll see how that goes. But my feeling is that it won't be lasting for very long. In a few years, we'll be talking about peacefulness and expansion of consciousness once again.
That's very interesting. Um, the concept of in Chinese medicine, or we call it Ming, which is essentially like a destiny or life purpose. And I know that the Vedic sciences have their own name for it. Someone who's wanting to connect to that or connect, you've talked about the archetype of love and connecting to beauty in that sense, but someone who's sort of, I don't know, they have an addiction or they're not experiencing any meaning in their life. What would you recommend that they could do? What's the first thing that they could start doing to connect with that?
If you don't have any sense of meaning in your life, which can happen today because people are addicted to their cell phone and social media, then it is a bit hard, because what happens is that you get dumb, sort of. You are not interested in meaning means that you more and more depend on external things to do what you should do, which is to find meaning in your life. But more and more you give to the technology, like right now it is the computer technology, generative AI, and people are depending on them to generate meaning. But they can generate only old meaning. They cannot generate any new meaning. Old meaning is not exciting. So they generate and you live your parallel life in contraction. You never expand your consciousness. This is what is taking place. To bring from that to a different way of life, where you will seeking the expansion of consciousness, is not easy. And I'm not going to say that it is easy. It is going to be difficult, and it will require a huge coordination of social efforts in order to bring these people back to meaning. In other words, we are literally going backwards. To move forward again is not going to be an easy task. But here is the point. I already mentioned the 15%. Suppose 10 to 15% of people are already not doing that. Why are they not doing that? Because they have, this is the new concept that quantum science introduces, reincarnation. They have reincarnated many times and already have gotten rid of all those tendencies that goes backward. So they cannot go backward, as I mentioned earlier. These people who are already into meditation and creativity and happiness cannot go backward. And they can lead the other people. They can inspire the other people. This is something also in the human characteristic. As you become an information addict, you can be manipulated. You can be manipulated towards the bad, towards the evil, like followers of Donald Trump. You can also manipulate it towards the good, like followers of John F. Kennedy or Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi. They also inspired a lot of people. I do not use the word manipulation for what they did, because it was not manipulation, it was inspiration. But inspiration is a word of which the shadow word is manipulation. Manipulation is cynical. Inspiration is not selfish, but selfless. Inspiration really is directed towards evolving the other, whereas manipulation is evolving the other to what you want. It's a shadow of inspiration, but both exist. So leaders will come along who will inspire people to get into the new archetypes and archetypal investigation. It won't happen without leaders. Leaders are very important.
You say? Thank you so much for your time today. That's been amazing. When I did your part of your master's course, it was incredible. I learned so much. I had so many experiences where I could get out of that brain notification state and just see that everything was consciousness. It sounds crazy saying it out loud, but when you experience it, it's so freeing and it's so much closer than most people think. Not to say it's not hard work, like you say, but what you're doing is incredible. So good to speak to you. You mentioned that you run some master's PhD courses. Where can people find you?
Well, the easiest way to find me is my website, amitgoswami.org, amitgoswami.org. Here is also, you can find all the information about our educational program, transformational educational program, master's, PhD, and certification. That's what we give. That is the destiny of people who engage with our program. So please remember that transformation is available to you. All you have to do is to get interested in doing something for the world rather than keeping yourself towards this pleasure-oriented, information-oriented life.
Amazing. Thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you.